Hi, and welcome to class. So I'm going to start this semester with examining Chapter 3, which is the musical building blocks chapter of this text, because it gives you a little time to get comfortable and it helps us to understand what are the building blocks, what are the pieces and parts of music that we are going to talk about. And actually there are places in here and in several of the books I've read about music where they start to talk about the ear and the inner ear and how it is responding to sound and particularly to music. And so I'm putting that here. I'm going to talk about the sound stimulus, and then I'm going to talk about the ear and how it is taking in that information about sound and processing it so that the brain can understand it. So again, I'm going to start with the elements of sound. This is a very short piece of the chapter in your textbook, and I'm going to go into it in quite a bit more detail so that you know what I'm referring to with some of the language about pitch and timbre and all of those things. And then I'm going to do a short section on the ear, as again he alludes to it, and a lot of people do. It helps to understand it. And for today, we will talk about periodic motion, that aspect of music, as well as this section called the discovery of music within sound. So getting the pieces and parts to get a little bit more complicated so that we can discover music from that sound stimulus. So one of the reasons I've gotten more and more excited about teaching this class and thinking about my desire of why I want to teach this class is comes from the fact of how much I appreciate sound and audition, as it's often called in the textbooks, in our lives, how important that is to me. So when I teach sensation and perception, we spend the first third of the semester at least talking about vision. I understand, or always understood, more about vision. That used to be all they talked about in a sensation and perception class, and I understand a lot of it filtered through, as we all filter our classes through our own experience and background, especially something like sensation and perception, filtered through my own really poor eyesight and some of the kind of visual mental games that I used to play as a kid, and these kind of magic books that were really just visual illusions. They were called back when we were kids, they called it magic. But then we get to sound, and because my vision has always been so poor, what I've learned the more I talk about sound is how much I have learned to use my auditory system to tell myself about what's happening in my environment. And also, so I have a little bit of ADHD, and my attentional skills are such that I'm either really hyper-focused or I'm having a hard time focusing, and that's a lot of visual stuff. So again, my auditory system is giving me a great deal of information about my environment. And I know you can think of examples for yourself. So I want to take a second here to just appreciate our sense of hearing. Again, we often talk about it as audition or auditory perception. I'll probably go back and forth quite a bit. So I want you to, for just a few seconds here, I'm actually going to time us for a little while so that we stop, close your eyes, listen carefully. Just stay quiet for a few seconds. Okay, and you can open your eyes, of course, and I'm going to ask the question. My green questions are questions that I'm actually going to leave a little time for you to think through. So what did you hear during that time of being quiet and just listening? And again, this is the first PowerPoint lecture, but you will get used to these silences where I give you a chance to think through the answer. I want you trying to really be actively involved in your thinking while you're listening. And for this, I'm gonna do what I usually have heard in past classes. What I usually do is I listen carefully and think, what am I hearing? What am I sensing at this moment? And I wait until I really notice at least 2 or 3 things of movement out there. And you might have heard me rustling in my chair. You might have heard, as I sometimes meditate and listen to Pema Chodron, you might have heard sounds within the room. You might have heard sounds outside of the room. And so just paying attention to what you are hearing. But again, I want you to gain some appreciation. I know I'm taking a long time to talk about appreciation, but notice when your sense of sound, so we're not going to talk about sound localization or anything in a music class, but notice when your sense of sound tells you where somebody is coming from or who's coming, if you know how their gait is a bit, or what's happening in your environment. And I hope that you gain not just an appreciation of music over the course of the semester, but just our ability to hear sound is really quite incredible. So the sound stimulus is basically vibrations of molecules. So there are always molecules in the air, and when we hear some kind of sound like that is vibrations of those molecules where those air molecules are coming closer together. So there's a change in air pressure, there's higher air pressure, and then those molecules come farther apart. So there's lower air pressure, and that is occurring kind of in this outward way, in a way. It's traveling through media, so for example, sound is traveling through the air in order to hit my microphone, and then you're going to be hearing it from your speakers, and it's going to be traveling through the air. And I like this picture from E. Bruce Goldstein's Sensation and Perception, because it shows this kind of how it's traveling through that medium. It travels through water. So if you've ever noticed when you're underwater, it's more difficult to hear, but the sound is traveling through water. Water is just denser. It travels in waves, as I was just talking about with the speaker. You're kind of seeing these waves. I'm going to show these waves on the very next slide, kind of how this is happening with air molecules coming together and coming apart and coming together and coming apart, this kind of wave-like fashion. And just for reference, it's moving at a fraction of the speed of light. So 340 meters per second through air, or 1,500 meters per second through water. Whereas if we look at 340 meters per second through air, keep in mind light is traveling at 300,000 kilometers per second, showing us why we see the lightning before we hear the thunder. And the other thing this picture shows, which is why I really kept it for this class, to just give this idea of how, so it's traveling, and it sounds like it's traveling from me to the microphone, the speakers to you, but there's also what's happening with the molecules in the air is that they are in a particular space, coming together and coming farther apart, and coming closer together and coming farther apart. And Goldstein shows this with the when you throw your line in the water. So in the B part of this picture, we see these ripples, and they look like as you throw the line right in the water at first, you'll see the ripples kind of moving out. But what do you see that little boat doing, right? It's not moving. It's not being pushed away from the center. The water is being displaced, going up and down at a particular place. And so that can hopefully help you kind of understand how these changes in air pressure are happening at a particular location and staying there, even if the sound in waves the waves are traveling, if that makes sense. I'm going to start by talking about a pure tone, and we're going to get to where eventually we're talking about listening to several instruments, and I'm going to use actually the example of a singer. So a singer is singing lyrics to a song, and this pure tone makes it all look so easy and simple and straightforward. But if you imagine kind of what's coming even just out of my mouth right now, that sound stimulus is much more complicated. When you add it to it, the changes in pitch that a singer is going to be making as they're singing, and then adding all the musical instruments, it's going to get more and more and more complicated. But I'm going to stick with this pure tone to start with. So we're looking at these pressure changes, and we're describing them now as a pure tone. We can describe it in a sine wave or a sinusoidal waveform. It's where we have the increased pressure. Remember those molecules coming together. We're going to see that as what's in a process called condensation. And then as those molecules kind of come farther and farther apart, we're going to see that in a process called rarefaction. And so this is going to repeat. And so the top is showing on a nice figure, just kind of giving me an amplitude, just giving me my loudness. Going across time, we are seeing one cycle of this sound wave, of this pure tone. And on the bottom, this is again from, I'm going to steal some of these from Goldstein because the pictures are just helpful. He's showing in the blacker it is, the more condensation, the closer together those air molecules, and the whiter it is, the farther away. So that white point is the point of the highest rarefaction. And I'm going to talk about time, amplitude, frequency as we move forward. I'm going to play a pure tone. We usually don't hear these in the environment. Okay, we can create these electronically. They say tuning forks, although they sound really different than electronic instruments to me. And then some authors, not all, say that some flutes are also pure tones. But here is a pure kind of middle A, a 440 hertz tone, pure tone. Okay, so the electronic always to me sounds actually a little bit ugly, and we're going to have to add something to this pure tone to get something like a piano. So that would have been the closest to middle C, middle A on the piano, but obviously that sounded much more stilted and electronic. It's a pure tone. Okay, aspects of the sound stimulus that I think your author and me and all of the articles you read for the class are probably going to just assume that you know. One is amplitude. This is measured in sound pressure level, sometimes called SPL. More usually we see decibels, which I'm going to show you really briefly. You don't need to know it, but it is, they compress the scale with a logarithm so that we can put information on a graph in such a way that makes sense. So what we're seeing, the size of the pressure change, how much are those molecules coming together and coming apart and coming together and coming apart. And amplitude is associated with loudness. And for the next few slides that I'm talking about the sound stimulus, I'm going to start with the sound stimulus itself there in bold. And then the last piece for some of these, you'll see the aspect of perception that translates to, also in bold and underlined. So what the figure on the right is showing is a high amplitude where you can see larger changes in air pressure, and then at the bottom is lower, so a softer perception. And I usually do this with my what you call it, my light stick thing, and show you. So I'm going to start low at the very bottom. Again, pure tone, I'm going to be speaking. Doesn't look like that, but it's fun. For me, this is funner than using a pure tone on the computer. So the low, the bottom one, is when I'm whispering to you. There's not much air pressure change. The medium one, the middle one, is probably how I sound kind of normally as I'm talking. And the top one, you might guess it, I'm going to yell at you. So when it's getting really loud, that's higher amplitude, higher changes in air pressure. Some of that information is repeated, and I have fun doing that, just so you know. Some of that information is repeated, and here's a table, again, not to give you a lot of things to remember, but just so you know and can see that we're starting our amplitudes at 1 in the sound pressure level, that measure. That's barely audible. It gets much louder, much faster, like so in this kind of exponential way, such that if we're talking about leaves rustling and we're putting this all on a figure, it's going to be pretty close to my barely audible. If I can just hear something, an average speaking voice is going to go now up to 1,000, and by the time we get to the threshold of pain, where we're probably actually damaging our inner hair cells at 10 million sound pressure level, that would make our figure go up into the sky. And so they just use this logarithmic scale. They changed it over to decibels so that we can talk about the sound stimulus and amplitude more easily. So the sound stimulus, the aspect of frequency, is another part of the sound stimulus itself. It's measured in hertz. This is referring to the number of pressure changes, or the number of times that we see those pressure changes per second, and that's going to repeat over time for these pure tones, or if we're holding a note with the piano or the violin or whatever musical instrument. It is associated with pitch, and so the aspect of perception is pitch. And I'm showing this in the figure from Goldstein of lower pitches versus higher pitches. And what he uses here is, it looks like 2 cycles is the low one. We actually wouldn't hear that because it's underneath our range of hearing. We hear sounds that range from about 20 hertz to about 20,000 hertz. And he's showing us here a high pitch with, I guess it's, I'm not going to count that, 10 to 12 or whatever hertz, but really I'm speaking probably at about 2200 or whatever, something around that. That's usually speech, hertz. And so frequency, for me to give you this idea of what is the perception of pitch. For the low, again, I'm not a sinusoidal waveform pure tone. I'm a person speaking, and I'm not going to be at 2 cycles per second. I'm going to be at something you can hear. Low tone is when, or low pitch is when I'm trying to sound like a big guy. Okay. The middle pitch is probably about where I am as a female with a relatively low voice, and the high pitch would be, if I can do it, when I try to sound like Mickey Mouse. So that's frequency to pitch. So here are some of the characteristic dimensions of sound, some of which I've just gone through and some of which we're going to discuss in more detail as we move forward here. Pitch, so how high or low someone's voice sounds or an instrument sounds, it comes from the frequency, the number of times per second that we see those pressure changes. And again, remember that's the physics of the environment. Our perception, our sense of loudness, how loud a sound is, mostly comes from the amplitude. But if we were to look at audibility curves, we would see that we hear certain frequencies better than others, and some of them we don't hear at all. And so frequency has to be some piece of that, but mostly it comes from the amplitude of the sound, or how much, what's the size of the pressure change. And then timbre, which I'm going to talk about here a bit more than your author does. He talks about it later, talks about it a great deal as if you know what he's discussing, and so I'm going to do a small introduction of timbre. And this is the purity or mix of the waveform. So far we've talked about pure tones, which are sinusoidal waveforms or pure sine waves. They don't sound that good. Almost everything we hear is a mixture of sound waves, and the pitch that we're hearing is the dominant sound wave. And some of those, what's mixed in there, are harmonics, as they're called, and we're going to discuss for a while here. The harmonics, the specific harmonics, give us the timbre. Does this sound like the middle C on a piano, or does it sound like a violin, or does it sound like a trumpet, and so forth. So the timbre is going to be changing those harmonics. Another thing to keep in mind, just to keep it in mind, because I'm not sure how much your author refers to it as this notion of perception of tone chroma, but I know we're going to talk about it a great deal. These notes on a piano or whatever instrument we're playing that are denoted with the same letter. And so this is showing you in orange there, he's pointing to, this is again Goldstein, the letter A, And I'm going to have you watch this complex tone where a music professor discusses complex tones, and he uses A, that 440 hertz, which is what I played the pure tone of over my computer here, because many instruments play it. I like the letter A because as we move up the keyboard and down the keyboard, we don't have any weird decimal places. And I like things to be simple. So 440 hertz is that one right above middle C. And as we go down, I'm going to go down 220 hertz down to the next A, 110 hertz down to the next A, 55 hertz down to the bottom A, 27.5 hertz. And I don't know if you noticed that earlier on, but if we go back up to 55, 110, 220, 440, the next one's going to be 880. The next one's going to be, can maybe think through it, 1760. Okay, so we see a doubling, and that in the fundamental frequency of the pitch. So they are really sharing something very important in that they are multiples of each other. So as we're going to talk about timbre, I'm going to go ahead and discuss the complex tone as the kind of background for that. They are, as I said, the pure tones really don't exist very much in the world. They don't sound very natural. Most of what we hear, pretty much all noise, is complex tones. So it's made up of these harmonics, and it's a mixture of the waveforms. And we're hearing whatever frequency we're hearing is the dominant frequency, or what we're going to call the fundamental frequency. And it's good to distinguish, just for our understanding, that most of what we'll be talking about in music is periodic. As we are holding a note on a musical instrument, we're going to see that same pattern of pressure changes repeating multiple times per second, right, depending on whatever the frequency is. But we also hear in music, because people are singing, and so there's speech as part of that. We hear aperiodic sounds as well, which would be the singing, speech, static. If you're listening to a radio and it's static kind of going in and out, that is aperiodic. It does not have that same kind of repetition that is predictable, and it's more complex than periodic. So I'm going to now have you come out of this slide presentation and go watch this YouTube video.